The smell of lilies and stale grief hung heavy in the air, a scent synonymous with the end. Elias's body lay in the polished mahogany casket, a picture of tranquil repose, a lie painted on the face of a man who supposedly died of a sudden, massive heart attack. The living room, converted into a makeshift funeral parlor, was packed with mourning relatives, their whispers a constant, low-frequency hum of sorrow. Yet, amongst the sea of black suits and veiled faces, a single, jarring figure stood out. His wife, Seraphina. She wasn't weeping, nor was she stiff with shock. She was receiving a comfort that was profoundly inappropriate, a solace delivered by a man who was not family, a man whose presence was a searing insult to the very concept of mourning. This man was Marcus, and he was Seraphina's lover. The clock on the mantelpiece chimed 7 times, marking the end of the first full day of the wake. Elias's mother, Eleanor, a woman whose face was usually a map of gentle kindness, watched through narrowed, tear-reddened eyes as Seraphina excused herself from the cluster of grieving in-laws. She walked directly, without hesitation, to Marcus, who was leaning casually against the archway leading to the dining room, looking more like an impatient date than a respectful mourner. He wasn't even wearing black. His charcoal suit screamed business as usual. Seraphina reached for his hand, not a furtive brush, but a firm, possessive clasp. She pulled him further into the shadowed corner, near the grand piano that Elias used to play, and the whispered exchange that followed was horrifyingly intimate. Eleanor didn't need to hear the words. The body language was a language of its own, a brazen dance of 2 people united in a secret, thrilling victory. Marcus's thumb stroked Seraphina's cheek, wiping away a single, artfully placed tear, and she leaned into the touch, a silent acknowledgement of their illicit bond right next to the coffin of the man whose death had cleared their path. The shock rippled through the immediate family like a cold, fatal wave. David, Elias's younger brother, a man known for his unflappable calm, felt his knees buckle. He had always suspected Seraphina was too cold, too self-centered, but this was a public execution of decency. He watched as his father, Arthur, a pillar of the community who had just lost his eldest son, turned a sickly shade of white. Arthur started to walk towards the pair, his gait unsteady, but Eleanor placed a restraining hand on his arm. "Not now, Arthur. Not yet. Let the house empty first." Her voice was dangerously quiet, a tremor of pure, suppressed fury. She understood something deeper than mere infidelity. This was a statement, a deliberate provocation meant to establish a new order before the soil had even settled on Elias's grave. The relatives, sensing the shift from quiet sorrow to explosive tension, began to file out with awkward haste, shooting furtive, condemning glances at Seraphina and her visitor. When the last distant cousin had gone, the room was left to the family. Eleanor, Arthur, David, and David's wife, Clara, and the defiant couple. "Seraphina," Arthur finally managed, his voice a gravelly whisper of pain and disbelief. "What is the meaning of this? Who is this man, and why is he comforting you like a husband?" Seraphina straightened, her expression instantly shifting from soft vulnerability to hard, unapologetic calculation. "Arthur, this is Marcus. He is a very dear friend. He is helping me through this difficult time." Her tone was patronizing, dismissive of their profound grief. Marcus, emboldened by Seraphina's defense, even offered a small, smarmy nod. "My deepest condolences on your loss, sir." David finally stepped forward, unable to contain his righteous anger. A dear friend? Are you bringing your lover to my brother's wake? Are you insane, Seraphina? He's lying right there. David gestured violently toward the casket. Seraphina's reaction was not one of shame or guilt, but of annoyance, as if they were the ones creating the inconvenience. Lower your voice, David. It's an unfortunate situation, I agree, but life goes on. Elias is gone. I need support. Marcus understands me. It was then that the truly chilling revelation came not from Seraphina, but from her side of the family, who had remained silent in the kitchen until this confrontation began. Seraphina's mother, Lydia, walked into the room, impeccably dressed and wearing an expression of supreme indifference. Honestly, why the melodrama? The man's dead. It happens. Seraphina is young and attractive. She needs a partner. If she's found someone who can comfort her so quickly, then good for her. Loss is terrible, but you find a new husband, don't you? What else is she supposed to do? This cold, pragmatic cruelty, delivered with the nonchalant air of discussing the weather, was the final blow. Arthur swayed, the sheer magnitude of the betrayal and the family's complicity threatening to overwhelm him. They were not only accepting the infidelity, but celebrating the new beginning over the freshly deceased. What they didn't know, what no one knew except for a select few who held their breath in distant shadows, was that the man in the coffin was not dead. Elias Vance was very much alive, and his supposed death was the masterstroke of a desperate, brilliant plan to expose the moral rot that had infested his marriage and his wife's family. He was watching, or rather listening, from a vantage point he had engineered, cataloging every callous word, every cruel gesture, preparing for a dramatic resurrection and an even more dramatic reckoning. The wake was merely the first act in a very long, very painful play of deception and revenge. The silence that followed Lydia's shocking statement was the calm before the storm. A storm that Elias was about to unleash. The shock of Lydia's words paralyzed the Vance family. Arthur, unable to speak, simply stared at the coffin, his mind reeling. The depth of Seraphina's disrespect was matched only by her mother's callous disregard. David, however, was past the point of restraint. "You are disgusting," he spat at Seraphina, "both of you. How dare you talk about replacing Elias when he hasn't even been buried? This house is built on his success, his generosity, and you treat his memory like refuse." Seraphina crossed her arms, a slight smirk playing on her lips. "Generosity? David, please. Elias was controlling. He made the money, yes, but he held the strings tight. Now the strings are gone. The money is mine, and Marcus and I are going to manage things properly." She spoke of Elias's considerable estate as if it were a prize she had fairly won, not a legacy she had inherited through tragedy. "Manage things?" Eleanor finally intervened, her voice low and laced with venom. "You think you will simply walk into the bank and take what is ours? My son's lifetime of work?" Marcus stepped forward then, taking on the air of a calculating business partner. "Mrs. Vance, I believe you'll find that Seraphina is the sole beneficiary of Elias's most recent will. It was updated quite recently, wasn't it, Seraphina?" He looked at her pointedly. Seraphina simply nodded. The revelation hit them with the force of a physical blow. A new will? Updated without their knowledge? Elias had always been meticulous about his affairs, assuring his parents would be financially secure and that David would take over the running of his investment firm. This deviation was entirely out of character for the cautious, family-oriented Elias they knew. It added a sickening layer of premeditation to Seraphina's actions. "That's impossible," David muttered, shaking his head. "Elias would never cut us out. He promised me the firm."
Promises don't hold up in probate court, dear David, Lydia chimed in, stepping closer to her daughter. Signed documents do, and since Elias is not here to dispute it, well, Seraphina and Marcus have a lot of planning to do. This house, for example, is far too large for them. Perhaps they'll downsize, sell off some of Elias's less practical assets. The implication was clear. The house, the firm, everything Elias valued and protected was now on the market, subject to the whims of the new power couple. Eleanor and Arthur exchanged a look of profound, shared despair. They weren't just grieving a son, they were watching his entire life, his work, his home, his memory, being systematically dismantled by the woman he had married. The injustice was staggering, the betrayal absolute. They realized then that their only recourse was legal action. But Seraphina, supported by her ruthlessly pragmatic mother and her opportunistic lover, had already established a position of unassailable advantage. Meanwhile, a few blocks away, tucked inside a rented, nondescript apartment, Elias was watching the scene unfold on a complex array of screens. He was not pale and cold, but tense and alert, dressed in comfortable street clothes. His coffin was an elaborate custom-built cooler containing weights and a few well-placed dummies, all executed with the help of a former military colleague who now specializes in private security and discreet logistics. The entire operation, the feigned heart attack, the compliant and heavily compensated doctor, the rigged casket, had taken 6 months of meticulous planning. Elias watched the feed from the small high-definition camera he had embedded in the room's decor. He saw the genuine, agonizing shock on his parents' faces, the fiery righteousness in David's eyes. This pain was necessary, a temporary suffering to save them from a permanent catastrophe. He saw Seraphina's cold entitlement, Marcus's calculating smugness, and Lydia's chilling lack of remorse. The will. That was the confirmation he needed. He had prepared 2 wills before his death. The first, the genuine one, ensured his family was protected and provided for. The second was a fake, a document he had deliberately left exposed for Seraphina to find, knowing she would immediately seize upon it. He had needed to give her the illusion of total victory, the confidence to reveal her true colors, and her ultimate plan. She hadn't just settled for the inheritance, she had actively sought to cut his family out entirely. Elias had suspected the infidelity for nearly a year, noticing the sudden distance, the coded messages, the inexplicable expenses. But suspicion wasn't proof. To successfully divorce Seraphina, he would lose half his wealth and she would walk away wealthy and unpunished. To expose her and Marcus fully, to ensure they faced the consequences of their emotional and financial conspiracy, Elias realized he needed a plan so extreme, so disruptive, that it would force them into the open. He had to become a ghost, watching his own funeral. He leaned closer to the monitor as Marcus took Seraphina's hand once more, pulling her close. "It's done," Marcus whispered, his voice clear through the surveillance microphone. "The Vances are defeated. Tomorrow we start liquidation." A flicker of true, cold anger crossed Elias's face. He reached over and tapped a key on his laptop, activating a final, critical piece of the elaborate setup. It was a digital lock, a timer that would tick down until the moment of his resurrection, the moment he would walk back into his life, not as a grieving husband, but as a judge delivering his own verdict. The wake was over. The game was about to begin.
The morning after the wake, the atmosphere in the Vance mansion was thick with palpable tension and the lingering scent of betrayal. Arthur and Eleanor, hollow-eyed and weary, sat in the sunroom, desperately trying to construct a strategy. David and Clara were on the phone with their corporate lawyer, their voices hushed and frantic. They knew they were fighting not just for money, but for Elias's honor and their family's security. Across the hall, however, the mood was celebratory. Seraphina and Marcus, operating with brazen efficiency, treated the house like a newly acquired corporate asset. They sat at Elias's massive, antique desk, surrounded by stacks of documents, blueprints, and ledgers. Marcus, already taking on the role of the master of the house, had poured himself a glass of Elias's rare scotch, a habit he knew Elias despised, and was dictating instructions to Seraphina. "We need to freeze all the non-liquid assets immediately," Marcus stated, swirling the amber liquid. The art collection first. It's valuable, untraceable, and easy to move. I have a buyer in Geneva who doesn't ask questions. Next, the firm. We sell a controlling interest to one of our contacts, quickly, before the Vances can get an injunction. Seraphina smiled, a genuine, greedy expression. You're brilliant, darling. I knew this was the right path. No more waiting around for Elias to die of old age and split the estate 6 ways. This is cleaner, faster. Lydia arrived shortly after, not to console her grieving daughter, but to assist in the inventory. She approached the desk and pointed to Elias's prized watch, a rare vintage timepiece resting in a leather box. That goes straight to auction, Seraphina. Get maximum value. Sentiment is expensive. The conversation was loud enough to drift down the hallway, reaching the ears of the remaining Vance family members like cruel, mocking laughter. David, overhearing the plan to liquidate Elias's firm, slammed the phone down. They're moving too fast. The funeral isn't even tomorrow, and they're already selling his legacy. We have to stop them. Clara, David's wife, who'd been quietly observing Seraphina for years, offered a chilling insight. They aren't just stealing David, they're trying to erase Elias. Every item they sell, every asset they move, is a piece of his identity they're shredding. They want to bury him completely, legally and physically. The lawyer confirmed their fears. Seraphina's claim, backed by the updated will, was legally sound on the surface. To dispute it required solid proof of fraud or undue influence, proof they did not yet have. Their only advantage was time, which Seraphina and Marcus were rapidly eliminating. Meanwhile, Elias, in his hidden apartment, was meticulously tracking their every move. The surveillance footage confirmed every cynical suspicion he had harbored. He saw Seraphina and Marcus celebrating, toasting his death with his own liquor. He heard them discuss how they had meticulously planned for years to wait until he was successful enough to make their payday worthwhile. Remember the time Elias almost caught us at the beach house? Seraphina giggled, taking a sip from her lover's glass. I told him I was visiting my sick aunt. He was so ridiculously trusting. Marcus laughed, a deep, unpleasant sound. He was a fool, Seraphina, a predictable, hard-working drone. He built the nest, and we are the clever birds who inherited the penthouse view. It's what he deserved for being so utterly boring. Elias, watching this venomous exchange, felt a deep, cold calm settle over him. The initial hurt was gone, replaced by a resolve of tempered steel. He wasn't just exposing an unfaithful wife, he was taking down a predatory criminal conspiracy. His parents' anguish, David's anger, the blatant disregard for everything he had ever built, it all fueled the final stages of his plan. He shifted his focus to the technical aspects. He was monitoring Seraphina's emails and had intercepted a series of highly sensitive communication between Marcus and the Geneva buyer. The firm, a legitimate operation built on ethical practices, was about to be sold to a shadowy organization known for asset stripping and money laundering. This was not merely selling a business. This was an act that could ruin hundreds of people Elias employed. This confirmed to Elias that the stakes were higher than just his personal revenge. The timing of his reappearance, the resurrection, was critical. It couldn't be too soon, or the crime would not be fully evidenced. It couldn't be too late, or the liquidation would be complete. Elias watched the clock on his dashboard, which was counting down to the final funeral service, the moment when the casket would be lowered into the ground. That would be the moment of maximum psychological impact, the point of no return for Seraphina and Marcus. He had one last task before the grand finale. He needed to make sure the evidence was organized and available not just for his family, but for the authorities he would contact the moment he revealed himself. Elias began compiling the footage, the conversation at the wake, the toasts, the explicit plans for asset liquidation, and the intercepted communication detailing the sale of his company to criminals. He packaged it all neatly, preparing the stage for his miraculous, terrifying comeback.
The day of the formal burial dawned clear and cold, mirroring the brittle mood inside the Vance mansion. Seraphina, dressed in a designer black dress that seemed more fashionable than funereal, supervised the final preparations with an air of brisk competence. She treated the event less as a mournful farewell and more as a contractual obligation before the final financial takeover. Marcus hovered close by, his constant presence a mocking shadow over the proceedings. Arthur, Eleanor, and David walked through the house like strangers in their own home, their attempts to delay the process failing against the barrage of legal documents Seraphina and Marcus produced. They had done everything they could, filed injunctions, contacted banks, but the carefully constructed paper trail Elias had left, which Seraphina believed was her golden ticket, was proving impervious to their efforts. They were fighting ghosts, realizing that Elias's death had not just taken him away, but had left them utterly exposed and vulnerable. "It's no use, Arthur," David murmured, defeated, as he watched the pallbearers arrive. "The lawyer said that until we can prove the will is fraudulent, which we can't, she has the full legal right to manage his estate. She's already signed preliminary agreements for the sale of the firm. It's too late." Eleanor stared at the mahogany coffin being moved by the men, a final, despairing image etched into her mind. "He's truly gone, Arthur," and she won. The depth of her sorrow was absolute. Seraphina caught Eleanor's eye and offered a small triumphant smile, a gesture of pure, distilled malice. She looked beautiful, utterly composed, and devastatingly victorious. She and Marcus were riding a wave of ill-gotten fortune, convinced they had pulled off the perfect victimless crime. The victim was conveniently lying in a box, and no one would ever suspect the circumstances. Meanwhile, in his remote hideout, Elias was performing the final checks on his elaborate mechanism. He had established a secure communication channel with his trusted lawyer, Thomas, a man who believed Elias was merely in hiding for his own protection, not that he was literally presumed dead. Thomas was standing by, prepared to execute a series of legal and public actions the moment he received Elias's prearranged code word. Elias looked at his reflection, a man who had spent days watching his own life be dissected and destroyed, yet who now radiated a focused, dangerous energy. The hardest part had been witnessing his family's genuine grief, but that pain was the cost of saving them from financial ruin and permanent devastation. He was about to deliver justice in the most personal and dramatic way possible. He checked the small, encrypted flash drive he carried. It contained all the evidence, the high-resolution footage from the wake and subsequent days, the intercepted emails detailing the criminal sale of his firm, and the full details of the legitimate will, which was safely filed in a separate, unassailable trust. The flash drive was the bomb, and his appearance would be the fuse. Elias had calculated the timing precisely. The gravesite was remote, surrounded by trees, offering minimal distraction. The service would be short, traditional, culminating in the priest's final blessing, right before the mechanical hoist would lower the coffin into the earth. That moment, the absolute finality, would be Seraphina's highest point of confidence, and her most spectacular downfall. He donned a dark, nondescript jacket and a cap, making his way stealthily to the cemetery. His contact had secured a discreet vantage point near the gravesite, hidden by a cluster of mature oak trees. He moved with the practiced stealth of a man used to complex logistics, his heart beating not with fear but with anticipation. He arrived as the funeral procession was concluding. Through the trees he watched the small gathering. Seraphina stood at the head of the plot, Marcus's hand resting possessively on her lower back. The priest began the final rites, his voice echoing solemnly across the manicured lawn. The rhythmic creak of the hoist began to sound, a prelude to the end. Elias took a deep breath, his eyes fixed on Seraphina's face. She looked down at the coffin, not with sadness, but with a palpable sense of relief, the face of a debt finally paid. This was it, the moment of truth. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, secured phone, ready to send the signal to his lawyer and simultaneously to a prearranged media contact. The priest spoke the final words, "Dust to dust, ashes to ashes," and the casket began its slow descent into the freshly dug earth. Seraphina closed her eyes, a small private smile touching her lips. She had won. Elias stepped out from the shadows of the oaks, his figure instantly commanding attention. He did not run or shout. He simply walked slowly, deliberately, toward the gaping grave, his footsteps muffled by the soft grass, interrupting the silence with an authority that chilled everyone present. The mourners nearest him gasped, some recoiling in terror, others scrubbing their eyes, convinced grief had finally brought on a collective hallucination. Seraphina opened her eyes and saw him. Her triumphant smile froze, fracturing into an expression of pure, unadulterated horror. Her face went slack, her breath caught in her throat, a soundless scream of total shock.
The stillness that descended upon the cemetery was heavier than any grief. It was the silence of disbelief, the shock of the impossible made real. Seraphina stood rigid, her eyes wide saucers of terror, staring at the man who was supposed to be 6 feet under. Marcus, instinctively recognizing the danger, took a half step back, his smug confidence evaporating into cold fear. Elias stopped at the edge of the grave, looking down at the descending coffin, a powerful symbol of the lie he had orchestrated. Then he raised his gaze, fixing it on Seraphina. He wasn't the grieving husband they had known. He was an avenging specter, alive and furious. "Hello, Seraphina." Elias's voice cut through the air, low but resonant, carrying the weight of the last few days of observation. "Did you miss me?" Arthur and Eleanor, initially frozen in fear, now surged forward, their terror replaced by a blinding, overwhelming surge of joy and confusion. "Elias, my son, you're alive!" Eleanor wept, rushing to embrace him. David followed, grasping his brother's arm as if to anchor him to reality. "I'm here, Mom, I'm fine," Elias reassured them, but his eyes never left Seraphina and Marcus. The relatives and mourners began whispering, pointing, the scene quickly devolving into chaos. Seraphina finally found her voice, a raw, strangled sound. How is this possible? You were dead." Her focus instantly shifted from shock to fear of exposure. Marcus, regaining a sliver of his composure, tried to bluff. "This is insane! A hoax! Who is this man? Seraphina, call security!" Elias smiled, a cold, humorless curve of his lips. "It's a hoax, all right, Marcus, but I'm not the performer. I was the audience to my own funeral and the star performers of my life's greatest betrayal." He took a small step closer, holding up the small, encrypted flash drive. "This is the evidence. Footage of you, Seraphina, receiving comfort from your lover, Marcus, at my wake, discussing the liquidation of my company to criminals, celebrating my death hours after my body arrived home, planning to strip my parents of their security and my brother of his future." As he spoke, the sound system that the funeral home had set up suddenly crackled to life, connected by a simple override signal Elias had prepared. It began playing a recording, Seraphina's voice, clear and cold, saying, "The man's dead. It happens. You find a new husband," followed by Marcus's laughter and their financial planning. The audible proof was devastating. Lydia, Seraphina's mother, who had been lingering near the back, now tried to melt into the crowd, realizing the extent of their exposure. Before Seraphina or Marcus could react, the sound of sirens cut through the air. Elias's contact had worked quickly. Several unmarked police cars and a highly recognizable news van pulled up to the perimeter of the cemetery. Elias's lawyer, Thomas, rushed forward, holding a sheaf of documents. "Seraphina, Marcus, the police are here." Elias has filed a full complaint backed by irrefutable video and audio evidence. Furthermore, Elias's actual will, the one protecting his family, is filed under trust and immediately takes precedence over the fraudulent document you were using. Any sale agreement you signed in the last 48 hours is now null and void and considered financial fraud. Seraphina screamed, not in anger, but in frustrated fury, realizing her carefully constructed, callous plan had completely collapsed. She lunged towards Elias, but David and one of the arriving police officers intercepted her. "You ruined everything, you manipulative monster!" she shrieked, struggling against their hold.
Marcus made a dash for the gate, but two other officers, already briefed on the situation, intercepted him easily. He was placed under arrest for conspiracy, fraud, and attempt at theft of corporate assets, his expression a mask of defeated avarice. Elias watched the arrests, the pain in his heart slowly being replaced by the cold satisfaction of justice delivered. He turned back to his family, wrapping his mother and father in a tight embrace. The reunion was one of pure, unrestrained emotion. Grief transformed into overwhelming relief. "I needed them to think they had won," Elias explained to his weeping parents. "I needed them to be loud and confident so I could catch them in the act of erasing my life and destroying my legacy. It was the only way to get the evidence needed to protect you all." He looked at the crowd of stunned mourners, now reporters aiming cameras, and the entire cemetery became the stage for the biggest news story of the year: the dead man who walked out of his own funeral to expose his betrayal. The coffin was gently raised from the grave by the funeral staff, the symbolic end of the lie. Elias Vance was back.